Hi, my name is Itzel, and I am here today with my partner Alicia. Today in this podcast, we will be talking about the Middle Passage. The triangular trade was a route that allowed a trading connection to West Africa, Europe, and the New World. One of the biggest and most known trading systems in the triangular trade is the transatlantic slave trade, also known as the Middle Passage. Imagine yourself walking home one afternoon, and bam! You're kidnapped. You're taken to a place with other people like you, but worse, they are beaten and weak. You are chained, and you are wondering where you are, scared, hopeless, and praying that it's just a dream and you'll see your family again. Later that day, you are being carried on a ship with 300 other people. You don't know where you are going and why. All you know is that it's not for good and that your life will never be the same again. This has happened to every single slave that played a part in the Middle Passage.
The voyage made from Africa to the New World was called the Middle Passage. It was one of the darkest times in history, and it lasted from the early 1500s to early 1900s. The Middle Passage voyages took about 20 to 90 days, depending on weather conditions and sea routes. Most of the slaves that were brought to the New World were kidnapped and forced onto the ship to be slaves in the New World. These voyages went on for 400 years.
The people that were being kidnapped came from 8 major parts of Africa: Senegambia, West Central Africa, Southeastern Africa, Bight of Biafra, Bight of Benin, Gold Coast, Windward Coast, and Upper Guinea. Slaves had the worst life ever. It was sad and hard. They were abused mentally and physically. As slaves were being brought on the ships, they had to be examined naked either by a captain or by a surgeon to make sure that they were healthy enough to survive the long trip. They also checked the slaves to make sure that they didn't have any kind of deadly disease. Slaves that had a disease were killed. They did this to prevent that other slaves wouldn't get infected, because if they did, it meant that they would receive less money. Obviously, because there's so many slaves and not as much advanced technology as there is now, they could not catch everyone who had a disease.
There were settlements known as fattening stations along the Caribbean where slaves recovered from their journey. They got food to fatten up and baths in order to be clean so they could sell at higher prices. There was one custom that was kind of weird, which was they checked a person's teeth, kind of like they did to horses, to see what kind of health they were in, which was a very dehumanizing part of the Middle Passage.
Like Alicia said, they would check their teeth, but this was because they wanted to see if their gums were swollen, because if they were, that would mean that they had scurvy. Scurvy was a very popular disease back in their time. And often when you had scurvy, you would have bleeding in the gums. So that's how they would check if they were healthy or not. Some of the popular diseases that killed the slaves were scurvy and amoebic dysentery. Amoebic dysentery is an infection in the intestine that is passed on by eating contaminated food. The infection causes abdominal pain and severe diarrhea with blood. Scurvy is a disease due to the lack of vitamin C. This disease causes the slaves to feel tired, have muscle pain, bruising, bleeding gums, and rashes. Both scurvy and amoebic dysentery made the slaves lose weight and weaken. Because of this and no treatment, the slaves died. The dead slaves were thrown off the ships to the water. It was very harsh and sad how crew members of the boat killed the diseased slaves. They would chain them up to something and or someone else that was diseased and throw them off the boat. And obviously the slaves would drown, and it was very cruel. Measles, syphilis, and smallpox were diseases that plagued the ships that also led to many deaths. A very different disease is syphilis. This disease is transmitted through oral and anal sex that leads to death if not treated. Many of the enslaved women and some children were sexually abused by the crew members and sometimes even slaves. It was horrifying. Some of the women were even left pregnant.
Slaves tended to be packed in ships in two ways: loosely packed and tightly packed. Tightly packed ships had a larger number of slaves, but also a higher number of casualties aboard. They did this because the captains wanted to make more money and weren't afraid of the risk of losing that many people, while loosely packed ships had fewer casualties but also brought in a lot of money because, of course, they had fewer slaves. So an interesting part about what happened on the ships was something called fictive kinships, where the people on board, because they were separated from their families, they often formed little families where older women took on the role of their mother and the older men tended to take on the role of the fathers. And they tended to be odd groupings of people, but they always supported and helped each other. Sadly, the bonds that were formed ended at the sale of the slaves because obviously they were now separated again from a family. There was also a device called the iron muzzle used. The iron muzzles were used on people who were accused of being insubordinate or eating more than their fair share of food. They could barely talk and couldn't eat or drink with it on.
Slaves were put on the bottom of ships and spent several months on board. The slaves were beat, mistreated, and fed poorly. The bottom of the ships were filthy. They were not clean and were exaggeratedly crowded. Quote from a slave, "It was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us." Slaves even had to lay in urine, feces, and even the blood of other people. The slaves lived in the worst conditions ever. They were also treated like dogs and were beat for every little thing. Quote from a man in the Middle Passage. About 450 native Africans in a sitting or squatting posture, most of them having their knees elevated so as to form a resting place for their heads and arms. Some of the slaves protested against slavery by suicide and by refusing to eat. They believed that by killing themselves, they could encourage others to do it and make the crew leaders change their mind about slavery, though it did not really work out as planned. A few slaves, like Ottobah, who decided to bomb a ship, also wanted to make a change in the slaves were captured by the Europeans, who would sell them to the people in the New World in exchange for American goods such as sugar, cotton, molasses, rum, and tobacco, which was then taken to Europe. Goods that were sent to Africa were textiles, rum, iron, and manufactured goods. Between 1440 and 1640, the Portuguese had the monopoly on the African slave export. After the Portuguese, the British were in charge of the largest percentage of slavery in the 1700s. They were in charge of 2.5 million slaves out of 6 million. Slaves were sold to the New World from a range of $800 to $1,200. It's equivalent to $32,000 to $48,000 nowadays. The Middle Passage was a part of why slavery started in America. The slaves being brought to the New World were forced to work on fields. Others, mostly women, worked as housemaids and were treated as poorly as they were on the ships. Some never gave up and tried to escape. But it was a risky decision because if you were caught, you would be punished by death or harsh whips. Enslaved women were still being sexually abused. The sad part was that it would keep going on, and the women couldn't do anything about it. Another sad part of slavery is that they don't get paid for their services and are forced to work around strangers they don't even know. And also, they are a part of their families. Slaves were fed twice daily, and some sometimes did not even eat at all. It was said that 40% of the slaves on the boat would not make it, and died either of a disease or of starvation. Overall, 2 million slaves died on the voyages. This is about 1/3 out of all of the slaves that were brought to the New World. That's twice more of the deaths from Auschwitz-Birkenau, a concentration camp in Germany. Traders from the Americas and the Caribbean received enslaved Africans. European powers such as Portugal, England, Spain, France, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, and Brandenburg, as well as traders from Brazil and North America, took part in this trade. It is believed that African kings, warlords, and private kidnappers sold captives to Europeans who held several coastal forts. The captives were usually forced marched to these ports along the western coast of Africa, where they were held for sale to European or American slave traders in the barracoons.
Throughout the life of the Middle Passage, an estimate of 5 to 30 million slaves were brought to the Americas. Over 54,000 trips were made to buy and sell slaves, and about 2 million slaves died along the way. This was one of the most dehumanizing and horrific events in all of human history.